Jean Renoir. For anyone who's been exposed to his pictures, just the mention of his name conjures up the world of his cinema. And when I say world, I'm not saying that lightly. Renoir's body of work is so vast, so varied, so rich in natural wonders, and so alive to human possibility that it can't be pinned down. You can't define it because the films encompass so much, so many emotions, so many perspectives on life, so many different types of beauty. It's almost as if you don't watch his pictures, you live them and within them, along with their creator. Most of us know Renoir, or came to know him from his most famous pictures, Grand Illusion, Rules of the Game, of course, French Can-Can, The Golden Coach, or The River. But there are many sides and colors and values to Renoir. He went in many different directions, sometimes all at once and in the same film, and sometimes across different periods of his life and his work, which seem almost inseparable, judging from the pictures themselves. He once said that his ambition was to float like a cork over the stream of life. And I think he did this in his films, going wherever the stream took him. In this collection, you'll see Renoir flowing in and out of many different moods and tones. There's his remarkable feature debut, La Fille de l'Eau, which is filled with youthful exuberance over the medium itself, and where you can see pretty clearly that his strong visual sense was linked to that of his father, the great Impressionist painter Auguste Renoir. There are his two lovely silent short films, Charleston and The Little Match Girl, and the later and much darker Testament of Dr. Cordelier, where you see his love of the fantastic. There's his extraordinary adaptation of Émile Zola's Nana, starring his first wife, Catherine Hessling, his harshest film, and the one in which you can feel his strong ties to the films of Erich von Stroheim. There's La Marseillaise, which I consider to be one of the finest and richest historical films ever made, and there's The Elusive Corporal, one of Renoir's least known pictures made near the end of his career, where he revisited some of the themes of Grand Illusion in a very different emotional key. Taken all together, Renoir's films amount to more than great cinema. Like all the greatest art, they're sources of spiritual sustenance. There are moments in his pictures that reawaken me to the wonders of the world every time I watch them.
The auteur simply means that the person who made the film has a personality that you can see through all of his films. It's important to have this preserved for us, and is to have the works of Shakespeare or the paintings of Rembrandt.
Jean Renoir was one of the directors who was born almost at the same time as the cinema in 1894. By the time he entered filmmaking in 1924, he could contribute to creating a language of a cinema.
I do not know whether my father was a good filmmaker or not. I think he was a good philosopher, which is quite different. I think that his position is that there are people who are mistreated, either by other people who are in power or by the simple facts of life. And that we as human beings ought to try to make the lives of those people livable, you know? And I think that he believed in all his life.
When Jean Renoir was home convalescing from his war wounds in 1915, he'd actually been shot in the leg, which was almost amputated, he found cinema. He said, "Rare were the weeks in which I didn't see 25 films, all American, of course." He wrote, "It was almost an enchantment." Later, he discovered films from other parts of the world, too. He had acquired a bit of a reputation as a potter, but by the early 1920s, he'd abandoned ceramics for the cinema. You could say that Renoir got into movies in the first place in order to make a star out of his wife, Catherine Hessling, who had a very unusual screen presence. He had inherited quite a bit of money from his father, so he entered into movies as a financier as well as a producer and a writer. The first picture, directed by Albert Dieudonné, was called Catherine, and it starred Hessling. Renoir decided to direct the next film, La Fille de l'Eau, most of which were shot in the south of France at La Nicotière, a property owned by the family of Paul Cézanne, and Renoir also did a few weeks of work in a studio. La Fille de l'Eau is quite an extraordinary debut film. Like many first-time filmmakers, Renoir throws in absolutely everything you can think of, you know, wild melodrama, lyrical interludes, dynamically edited action sequences, and just as dynamically surreal dream sequences, and of course, pastoral interludes. No one ever filmed people in nature better than Renoir. The exuberance of the picture is infectious, as it is with many first films by great directors. They try to pack, their entire life and every feeling they've ever experienced into one picture. But there's also an extraordinary delicacy and sensitivity in this film. A sense of surprise, control of mood and tone, and an overwhelming visual poetry. In other words, this isn't just any first-time director. It's Renoir.
It's not often appreciated the extent to which Renoir was really interested in technical experimentation. He had the idea, well, okay, the camera gives the impression of continuous movement once the film is projected, but in fact, it's a series of discontinuous still images. And it's the machine of the camera that pulls those images down one by one to create the impression of continuity. Let's have Catherine act in the discontinuous way that the camera actually works. Let's have her act in a slightly jerky manner.
When he started in the movies, he was fascinated by tricks, by motion picture tricks. And this is why, in the film we're talking about, La Fille de l'eau, you have the dream of the little girl, which is realistic. He loved that sort of thing at the beginning. Then, later on, he decided that that was wrong, that technique did not count, that what counted was what was going on.
Renoir thought, well, film is black and white, so why should we have colored makeup or colored clothing, for that matter, on the actors? He painted her face white and he made her makeup black. It gives her a very stylized look. That's deliberate. It's not old-fashioned. As a matter of fact, it was experimental.
There are shots in La Fille de l'eau which are really, really beautiful. There is one where the man is walking along as the boat moves, and you see him constantly in frame, but the boat is going by in front of you, and it's just wonderful, wonderful. It's like a tracking shot, only it isn't a tracking shot. It startles you, and you think, this is a very interesting filmmaker.
Nana is based on Émile Zola's novel, and in many ways I think it's the harshest of Jean Renoir's pictures. That's not just because of the source material, though. Renoir turned to Zola on 2 occasions, in this film and at the end of the 1930s with La Bête Humaine, with Jean Gabin and Simon Simon. The story of that film is just as harsh, but it's a much warmer picture. Catherine Hessling, Renoir's first wife, was the star of Nana, and really the inspiration behind his first few films. These pictures were built around her, designed to make her a star. Hessling had lived in the Renoir household during the last years of Auguste's life, and she may or may not have been one of his last models. She'd been sent by Henri Matisse because he thought she was a perfect Renoir type. Her real name was André Heukling, but after they were married, she and Jean Renoir decided on the name Catherine Hessling because they thought it sounded more American. Renoir loved American cinema, and one of the directors he loved most was Erich von Stroheim, who would later act for him very movingly in The Grand Illusion. You can see the influence in Nana of Stroheim's film Foolish Wives in particular, in the attention to detail and the importance of clothing, setting, gestures, and in the film's generally tough and unflinching viewpoint. He learned a lot from Stroheim, and you can feel him processing and absorbing it in this very early movie, but of course, taking what he learned and making a film that belonged only to him.
Nana was a big studio film. It was a very ambitious undertaking, and probably what Renoir planned to do with Nana was break into the film industry on his own terms, saying, I can make an epic.
He honestly believed that he would not tell the actors what to do. He would try to get it out of them. And here there is something important. He has mentioned that himself. And there is a little film in French entitled la direction d'acteur, in which he is showing an actress how to interpret a few lines in a novel. And he said, you must memorize the text and say it with no expression whatsoever. I want no expression. And he has her redo it about 10 times until finally she has no expression. She said, now you have it. Now let's see.
Catherine Hessling's sexuality in Nana is deliberately disturbing, as is the sexuality of the character Nana in Zola's novel, but it's acted out in a particular way. The sadomasochistic aspects of the character Nana, as portrayed in this movie, are brought forward very clearly in alternation almost with these childlike aspects of her behavior. She's seen to be childlike but very calculating at the same way. One of the shots that gets us across very, very well, or series of shots, is when the Count Mufa enters her dressing room the first time. We get a close-up of this wretched-looking comb, dirty water, and see him looking at it, seeing her looking at him looking at it. She wants the comb. He goes to give her the comb, pulls the dirty hair off of it, gives her the comb to comb her hair. That's fetishism.
I think Nana, he thought, was going to be a commercial hit. He was trying to make an impression, really, and that was why he, in a sense, spent so much money on it. I think he probably regretted it later because Nana was such a commercial failure and there was no fortune left. How can you spend all that money?
Renoir did love to experiment, and that's essentially what Charleston is. It's an experiment and a holiday, as well as a joyous exercise in pure motion. Of course, it's a vehicle for Hessling, but also for Johnny Huggins, a dancer in an all-black revue in Paris. Huggins actually appears in blackface, a holdover from the minstrel era, and admittedly, there are moments in the picture that give you pause from a racial perspective. But on the other hand, it seems like a kind of cinematic holiday for everyone. After what must have been the extremely tough and demanding experience of shooting Nana, Charleston is actually a lot of fun and quite exhilarating.
Renoir wrote in his autobiography that he had to sell paintings he had inherited from his father in order to pay expenses for Nana. And he had some film left over, and so he made a film known as Charleston. If you look carefully at this advertising column, this little space bubble lands right on top of one of them. You can see that there's a poster for Nana. So obviously it was made after Nana.
He borrowed some money as well. They shot it in 3 days, and he made what he must have considered a joke, because it's a little sex parody, really, starring Catherine.
Catherine Hessling is an exhibitionist, but I think she became a likable exhibitionist. I can't say why we begin with a pet gorilla and then we move to something else, but I think they were having a good time. I think they were having a good time.
The picture that the French people in general had of American blacks was just like a caricature, you see. They also come out as being very rudimentary, very noisy, very jumpy up and down, you see. And my father, obviously, number one, thought that that was wrong. There was no reason they should be different from any other people. And number two, it was ridiculous. So his idea was to turn things around. And he therefore brings from outer space a black scientist who looks upon a white girl as the Europeans look upon the blacks. That you see, he has turned things completely around, and the lesson again is this: maybe we had better take a look at ourselves.
During the silent era, there was a great deal of homemade cinema. That is, that many filmmakers thought and worked like artisans and came to know everything about their craft, you know, the lights, the sets, the lenses, the film stock, everything. Now, technically speaking, Renoir was on the cutting edge during his beginning days as a filmmaker. He pioneered the use of softer, bounced light in the studio, and he promoted the use of more sensitive panchromatic film for interior shooting as opposed to the harsher tones of orthochromatic stock. He understood his art and his craft from every possible perspective, and he stayed flexible enough to work under many different kinds of conditions. In 1927, Renoir was invited to collaborate with Jean Tedesco. Tedesco was an exhibitor and the founder of a movie theater called the Vieux Colombier, which specialized in avant-garde work. He ventured beyond exhibition into production and founded a film workshop in which filmmakers could work in complete freedom. Now, the film he made with Tedesco, based on the story by Hans Christian Andersen, is his most magical, and Catherine Hessling, Renoir's wife and the muse, of course, of his early work, gives a very delicate performance here, quite different from Nana. Now, there are many films that were made at the time in the fantastic vein in France. During this period, Jean Epstein's version of Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, for instance. But there's something about The Little Match Girl that sets it apart. It has to do with Renoir's sense of people, the way they move, the way they dream. In other words, the fantastic elements here are absolutely beautiful, magical, but they are elements in a larger, delicate human canvas.
My father also was convinced that Hans Christian Andersen was one of the great writers of the world, so that it was really, this film was really a labor of love. My mother in The Little Match Girl is quite different from Nana, very obviously, and from the Fille de l'Eau, unquestionably so.
It's a deliberately different style of acting. It's not an accident.
The Little Match Girl in the original, she's a child. When you put it into an adult, rather good-looking woman who is being sent out of her cabin into the snow against her will, it's harder for your suspension of disbelief to take place. But once she sits down in the snow and tries to warm herself by lighting matches, and the fantasy sequences start, then you realize what he's caring about is wanting to do all these kind of fun things with the camera and with special effects.
This is artisanal filmmaking. This is creative filmmaking. This is, you can do it if you really want to.
You have the scene on horseback on the clouds. He loved that sort of thing at the beginning. Then, later on, he decided that that was wrong, that technique did not count, that what counted was what was going on. And if you look at his last movies, you will find that there is no trickery in them.
La Marseillaise was made during one of the most charged moments in French history. Léon Blum was the prime minister, leading a very, very loose coalition of leftist groups and parties known as the Popular Front, with which Jean Renoir was heavily involved from the mid to late 1930s. In fact, this particular picture was financed during at least the first stages of production with subscriptions bought by members of the French trade unions. 2 francs got you a seat at the premiere of a movie celebrating, quote, the union of the French nation, the rights of man and of the citizen, unquote. When the front started to unravel, Renoir actually had to find more conventional forms of financing. To put it plainly, La Marseillaise is one of the greatest historical pictures I've ever seen. In this chronicle of certain events relative to the fall of the monarchy, the film's subtitle, history comes alive right from the opening frames. Renoir said that this was the one film on which he did copious research. He claimed that a large portion of the dialogue was found, rather than written, found in diaries, the minutes of political group meetings, pamphlets and chronicles of the time of the French Revolution. But I don't want to give you the impression that La Marseillaise is nothing but a history lesson. It's a movie about particular people and the particular world in which they live. You can feel the air they breathe, the way they think, the emotions that surge through them as individuals and in groups. And as in all the best Renoir pictures, every scene is emotionally rich and varied. And I marvel at what he was able to achieve with his actors, the ease, the roughness, the sense of familiarity amongst themselves and with the viewer.
One of the lovable things about Renoir is how sympathetic he is to all the characters, because his king is not a nasty man. He doesn't understand quite what's going on, but he's not nasty.
Picard, cette perruque de travers me dérange. Tâchez donc de la mettre droite.
The Marseillaise is typical of his view that everybody has his reasons. The revolutionists, the Marseillaise battalions, are fine people, and the king is also a fine person. But they are caught in the cogs of the machinery of time.
Another thing about the movie that's really nice is that Renoir's very, very talented older brother, Pierre, plays the king. And we see the first shot that we see of Pierre, I think, is wonderful. It's a kind of actor shot. He's in profile, he's in bed, and he has some kind of ridiculous cap on his head, as if it's protecting his curls or something like that. Renoir knew a lot of famous people. He knew Coco Chanel. If you look at the costumes, you will ask yourself, how, in this time of incredible poverty, did he get such great clothes and shoes for his actresses and for the actors? Well, it's Coco Chanel. You know, France is France. Fashion wasn't rationed, even during the war. High fashion was morale. It was like what they say about the movies during the American Depression. You had to have movies.
The Marseillaise is a patriotic film. It was made to show off what it meant to be French and to be a revolutionary and to create freedom, what, liberty, equality, eternity, whatever it is, fraternity.
Arrête-toi, citoyen. Et je m'arrêterai aussi. Je voudrais te poser une question. Pourquoi nous battons-nous? Tu portes le costume de garde nationale et moi aussi.
It's a mistake to think that my father made films against war, that he was a peacenik. No, he was not. He was after something much more important than that, about relationships between human beings. And that is more important.
Renoir claimed that he was inspired to make an adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by his walks through the suburbs of Paris. It lies in my longing to guess the identity of the pallid inhabitants of those noble mansions, he wrote, before they dissolve in the rain and draw all that remains as basis for our dream with them into their decomposition. He also wanted to explore the modern world and the vogue for psychiatry. What makes The Testament of Dr. Cordelier a powerful experience is the performance of the great Jean-Louis Barrault in the two roles of Cordelier and Opal, that is Jekyll and Hyde. Barrault, who most audiences know as Baptiste in the great film Children of Paradise, was trained as a mime and was one of the most renowned actors in French theater. The controlled physicality of his performance in this picture is hair-raising. In fact, so hair-raising that when they shot the scene at the beginning where he attacks the child out on the streets of Paris, passers-by thought they were witnessing the real thing. They stopped and intervened and interrupted the shoot. Now, for those who know Renoir's pictures, the style of Dr. Cordelier takes some getting used to. The lighting is flat, and in order to use multiple cameras, it had to be. And there's a certain hardness and a coldness to the images that's unlike anything else by Renoir. Actually, you know, reminds me of those bare-boned pictures Fritz Lang made in America right before he returned to Germany, While the City Sleeps and Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. And yet, it's a fascinating movie. Renoir was looking at the hard, new post-war world with which he felt out of sync. It wasn't his world. It belonged to all the young people who had admired him, Godard and Truffaut and Rivette, who were just starting to make their own movies around this time. But Renoir felt obliged to express his own viewpoint, and it's valid. But Renoir had another reason for making this film. As you'll see, The Testament of Dr. Cordelier was shot in a very unusual way, very quickly in the studio and out on the streets with multiple cameras and microphones after rehearsing with the actors and technicians. In other words, just like a live television production. Renoir wanted to work in a new way, allowing his actors the kind of continuity they found on the stage. They didn't have to stop and start again with each new setup the way you do in most pictures. It's a bit like Hitchcock's experiment with the film Rope, but there's a difference. For Hitchcock, it was a matter of style, of giving the appearance of one unbroken take without cuts, and the film was all shot with one camera. What Renoir wanted was freedom for his actors, a kind of performance style different from the usual in movies. And Renoir also wanted to prove that there could be a bridge between television and cinema by making a picture for the theaters with TV production methods. He also wanted to show that French films could be made cheaply enough to compete in the marketplace with American pictures that had already made their course back home. Renoir was always ambitious that way.
Bonsoir, monsieur.
Ça, René.
Nous sommes prêts à commencer l'émission. Le film est au télécinéma.
Dans quel studio?
Au 14.
Eh ben, au 14.
One of the really wonderful things about Cordelier and this wonderful version of the film that's been restored is that we see Jean Renoir at the beginning.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Renoir.
We see him take on a fictional role as if he's a television announcer. And we see that first from the room he's in, and then we see it from inside the control booth.
Nous venons tout juste d'assister à la conclusion d'une aventure singulière. Tellement singulière qu'elle me semble digne de faire l'objet de l'émission de ce soir.
It's a treat. I mean, it's a real treat.
Barrault, who plays the doctor and the monster, is one of the great French film and theater actors. And so one of the enjoyments of this particular film is the chance to see him being able to play two different characters and display these different kinds of personality.
Barrault's acting style, it's a deliberate acting style that's chosen for the movie, and Barrault doubtless developed it along with Renoir.
Opal a disparu. Où se cache-t-il? Moi, je n'en sais rien.
His style for playing the first part, Cordelier, is very straightforward, very severe, almost harsh, and almost aristocratic looking. When he's playing Opal, then you would expect him to do something that makes him look different. Well, he does, but he looks different by his movements, by his postures, but there's something that comes over his face that maybe is surprising to people, that Jean-Louis Barrault could have that kind of bitterness almost, that kind of anger come over his face and envelop his entire body.
My father loved contrast. You have a guy who goes around killing people, but you have very funny circus-like music in the background. And that, of course, emphasizes what one might call the, not the tragic comedy, but the tragic comedy of life.
It's not Renoir's most successful film because I don't think he is a kind of filmmaker who really should inhabit monsters. It goes against his grain in a sense. As far as I know, the film never had theatrical release in America because it was considered television. So people who are watching this DVD are really lucky because they can see some films that they would not have been able to see even if they were trying to see them in the past.
No filmmaker, no matter how great he or she is, has ever been impervious to the changing fortunes of the industry. It's sad to say, but it's true, even Jean Renoir. It's difficult to believe, but near the end of his career, Renoir had a really tough time getting his projects off the ground. He had many pictures fall apart, including 3 Rooms in Manhattan, based on a Georges Simenon novel, and it was designed to star Leslie Caron, for whom he had just written the play Orville, or Julienne and Son Amour, which he wanted to do with Jean Moreau. In the early 60s, a novel called The Elusive Corporal fell into his lap. It was written by Jacques Perret, and a director named Guy Lefranc had tried for many years to get an adaptation off the ground without success. This movie was shot very quickly and cheaply in Austria. Now, the reason they turned to Renoir is simple. Most of the action is set in a German POW camp during the early years of the war, and the hero is a corporal, played by Jean-Pierre Cassel, who never stops trying to escape. In other words, a revisitation of Renoir's most famous picture, Grand Illusion. As you'd expect, of course, Renoir was never one to sit back and trade on the glory of an earlier movie. The Elusive Corporal has a very unusual tone, dry, humorous, and a little sad. The British critic Raymond Durgnat, who wrote a wonderful book about Renoir's work, suggested that the picture's tone of acceptance seemed close to Buddhism, and I see what he means. The corporal and his partners, they try to escape 6 separate times. Along the way, as you'll see, there's terror, there's tenderness and fraternity, there's tragedy, and there's laughter. The Elusive Corporal is an old man's film. It has the kind of relaxed distance and visual plainness you might see in those late Fritz Lang films or in John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. This particular old man's film has an eloquent simplicity, particularly in its final moments. That's quite rare in any art form.
The elusive corporal is generally not looked at because people tend to say that it's a remake of Grand Illusion, in that Grand Illusion was an escape movie.
But the people in this one have their own attitudes towards war, towards France, towards being prisoners, towards escaping.
Bienvenue au Lager des Ziegelwerk. Mais Achtung! Les sentinelles tireront sur ceux qui s'échapperont.
And they realize then that they're stuck in this prisoner war camp. But it's done in a funny way. They're serious events when they're talking about the various ways of escaping. They're funny, but they're also serious.
My father was convinced that big size, large size actions are the result of stupidity. And that he got very much from his own father, who thought that wars were the most ridiculous thing. He didn't think they were good or bad, but they were absolutely ridiculous, you see.